Welcome to today's lecture 7. We are going to have a quick discussion on crisis management and communications research. So let's start with crisis. So what is a crisis? The accepted definition of a crisis is an unexpected event that threatens to harm the organization or its stakeholders. And I've given a couple of examples there. Athlete scandals like doping, natural disasters like storms and earthquakes, political instability that could maybe affect in particular events. And what of COVID-19? And I want us to stand still there for a few seconds and maybe have a quick discussion. Do you think COVID-19 qualifies as a crisis? If you do, why? And if you don't, why not? I think it was a crisis because it brought everything to a standstill and it forced sport industry to make decisions that would have taken years to advance. So I think it was a crisis that had good and negative outcomes. So how do we know if something is a crisis? What is the nature of crisis? Well, for it to be considered a crisis, the situation needs to happen unexpectedly. So nobody expected COVID-19 to happen. Also, nobody expects storms, earthquakes, they just happen unexpectedly. And when they do happen, you need to make decisions urgently. You cannot wait for somebody else to make the decisions for you or to see how it turns out. You need to make decisions immediately to minimize damage to the company or for your stakeholders. And when it happens, there's often a lack of control, or you feel like you cannot control what's happening, therefore everybody's under a lot of pressure. And of course, business operations are disrupted and the corporate image might be affected, excuse me. All right, so let's quickly look at the types of crisis. We have financial crisis, technological crisis, as well as natural crisis. What is a natural crisis? As you can see from there, it's often considered an act of God. So no human person can control, contain, or predict these types of crises. They occur naturally and nobody is responsible for these crises. That is what constitutes a natural crisis. What about financial and technological crisis? Well, a financial crisis normally emerges from the financial condition of the organization, and it's often influenced by the economy of the country. Sometimes it could be the economy of the globe that causes a financial crisis, like the IMF crisis of 1988, as well as the IMF crisis of 1994. Those were very big crises. I think some of them we know as the boom recession, boom depression, right? So those depressions are considered as financial crisis. Technological crisis occur when technology becomes complex. So when the company struggles to understand, to keep up with the technology, or to use or engage the technology in their daily operations, then they are in a technological crisis because they are being left behind and might lose their standing in the market. So when crises do happen, we need to be able to manage them, and this is known as crisis management. There are three distinct stages of crisis management, which is pre-crisis. Okay, so this is before the crisis actually occurs. You need to prepare for a crisis. You might know what crisis to expect. You might not know what crisis to expect, but to be prepared helps you to reduce the impact of that crisis. And then the second stage is crisis response. So when the crisis actually occurs, then you are prepared from the pre-crisis stage, and then you are able to respond to it. The post-crisis is when you then analyze your response as well as your planning and preparation, and then improve on that for the next time. Okay, so there we go. There's the pre-crisis planning stage. First of all, you need to establish a crisis team. Okay, for example, when they're planning big events, major events or mega events, or even local events, they will have a risk assessment team. So this team is the one that is responsible for the crisis planning. So you need to establish that team. It has to be people that have good research skills, people that can identify pending crisis or the crisis risk, so they can assess that risk there at stage 2, and then determine the impact that that crisis could bring on that organization, event, or tournament and the stakeholders thereof. Stage 4, they then need to plan the response in case of the crisis, make sure the plan is solid, and then review and update the plan before we actually have to respond to that crisis. So when the crisis does hit, then this is what you need to do. You need to listen. You need to see what the audience is saying. What are your stakeholders saying? What is happening inside the company? What is happening outside the company? And then identify what it is that happened to cause this crisis and why it happened, and how you can go about reviving from that crisis. Review. Okay, so you then need to check your tone of voice and make sure that it matches the level of crisis. For example, you can't sound excited when you are talking about an accident that happened that killed people. You need to then match your tone of voice to that crisis. If you are responding perhaps to a crisis that needs an apology, then you need to adjust your tone of voice to suit that response, and then you respond accordingly. Okay, so post-crisis, and this is when you now need to evaluate how you have planned and implemented your crisis plan. You then need to look at how the brand performed the strategy that you had planned for. Analyze how the media covered it and how you communicated to the media about this crisis. Analyze social media. Like we said before, social media can be a bit of a struggle because you cannot control what goes out. So once it's out, then it's very difficult to contain or control or manage. Then you need to learn from the crisis. There is always a learning opportunity out of every crisis. And post that, you can then conduct a fresh market research, and implement new communication strategies. Right, and this is crisis communication planning, the 5-stage model that we have there. And that is one that basically summarizes everything we've talked about. First of all, you need to identify the signal, do that research that we spoke about, and plan for the crisis. Damage containment would then be the implementation of that crisis plan. Recovery and learning would then be the post-crisis part. Now, when we look at this model, there's something that I want you to think about, or something that I would like you to investigate in your free time. And it's a very new theory known as the resilience theory. Perhaps we could take this to the group for discussion. The resilience theory in relation to sport post-COVID-19. And there are quite a number of articles that have come out with regards to this theory, investigating how sport events have recovered from COVID-19, investigating how sport organizations, tourism systems, and other companies in general have responded and come out post-COVID. It's a very interesting theory, and I think it could be quite useful to us as sport professionals to familiarize ourselves with it. Now, then we move on to the next lecture, which, like I said, I would keep very, very short because research is a topic that you have already done. So I'll simply just summarize it in maybe 2 or 3 slides. Right, so what is research? We all know the answer to that. It's a systematic gathering, recording and reporting of data. And in communication, this is the systematic gathering, recording, analysis of data relating to the image, identity, reputation, and perception by all stakeholders of a company, as we know. Right, so why is research necessary in communication? I'm sure you're asking yourselves, why am I talking about research? Well, we need to know our target audience. How do we know our target audience? We need to do research to become familiar with our target audience. Remember, we spoke about data analytics in our last lecture. That's how we get that data. We do research so that we get to know our target audience. And this helps us to plan and improve and refine our communication strategies, our public relations, as well as the IMC that we covered in the last lecture as well. Okay, so you're all very familiar with this, and this is where we will stop today. Okay, this is practical research in media relations. What is the research process? First of all, you need to identify a problem. And once you have identified a problem, you need to ask questions. Ask your research questions, conduct a literature review to see what has been done in the field, who has said what about what is happening, what were the outcomes, and what are the gaps, what's lacking. And then you identify a sample. A sample is always identified from a population. For example, if I say how many students play soccer in Bulawayo, right, then my population becomes all the students in Bulawayo, which is quite a big population. And then I need to select a sample, which means I can then narrow it down to find a representative sample for that population. You then need to identify your variables or your measurables. Okay, so what are you looking for in that hypothetical question? How many students play soccer in Bulawayo? My variables will then be students and students that play soccer. So those are my measurables. That's what I'm measuring. Okay, then you go on to the data collection process, which is an elaborate process and the most important part of research. Okay, how are you going to collect your data? Are you going to collect it qualitatively or quantitatively? That all depends on what you are gearing your research for. Do you want to explain things, or do you want to just find out information on how things relate to each other or what causes other things to happen? Is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? Is it easier to use questionnaires to get the kind of data you want? Is it easier to use interviews? Do you want to do focus groups? Would you like to maybe do an observation study, ethnographical study, and so on? So there's quite a number of ways that you can collect data, and that also speaks to how you will analyze that data. Once you have analyzed it, you then write a report and then you distribute it throughout the company, and we improve our communications and media relations that way. And then we go on to ask more questions when we identify a new situation. All right, so all questions can be asked in the group. We will continue this discussion in the group, and we'll see where it goes. So thank you so much for your time. See you again.